Okay, we're recording. Welcome, Yvonne, and those of you in the YouTube world. Um, this is a series of presentations, workshops that I, Samantha Parks, did as an English language specialist with a group of Brazilians. Yvonne, do you want to tell us a little bit about the project?
Yeah, thank you, Samantha. The project was related to English language specialist program, which was sponsored by the US Embassy and Consulate here in São Paulo. And our proposal was to talk about academic presentations and some kind of tips, some kind of a strategy, and how to be sure, how can prepare the material, and how to deliver better questions, and to use the suggestion to make better presentations. I think our goal was activity. Some people said that is not enough because they want more, but it's always possible to make more. But I think we got acquainted with this session, and we have made a good job. So it was a very important for our university, and I guess this partnership should continue if it's possible.
Yes. So we had a lot of people who wanted to attend our workshops, and we couldn't facilitate for all of them. So we decided to make this recording, which is going to be kind of like the highlights of the 3 days. Yvonne and I are going to be talking, conversing, sharing ideas. I'm going to go over the main points that we discussed, and that way we can share it with a larger audience, people who weren't able to attend synchronously. Now you can attend asynchronously. So we're going to go ahead and start. Our first day, we talked about understanding key points of speech and arguments in English. And again, this is sponsored by the US Embassy and Consulate and the Regional English Language Office. Do you want to talk a little bit about you, Yvonne, and your university?
Yeah, I'm here in São Paulo. I'm a professor in School of Communication Arts, which is in University of São Paulo, here in São Paulo, Brazil. And I have been teaching English since 2013. We have some kind of English for academic purpose, now just English language. We're gonna change it, but English is one of the core business of our work. And I have been other position in National Council of Education, where we just discuss a lot about bilingual education. So this topic is a hot topic nowadays, especially in Brazil. So I guess there are many people interested in this discussion and about this suggestion that they are going to make about on how to prepare and how to be able to make a huge presentation in English.
Okay, great. So let me say a little bit about myself. My name is Samantha Parks. I have a master's in English from the University of Kansas. I'm from Kansas originally. Right now, I live in Costa Rica. I also have a master's in TESOL, which is teaching English to speakers of other languages from American University in Washington, D.C. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Moldova, which was my first experience teaching English as a foreign language. I was the English language fellow in Nicaragua, and I now live in Costa Rica. And I'm the English language specialist in Brazil for right now.
Yeah, welcome.
For today. And let's talk about our goals. So the idea behind this session was to talk about some theoretical frameworks, what's going on behind the scenes before we make a presentation when we're preparing. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what our brains are doing when we communicate, talk about different kinds of arguments, what kinds of arguments will work for different audiences. We did have a group session where people were in small groups, and then we reflected on our observations and questions and answers. But I think that Yvonne and I are probably just going to talk, and we'll be the groups today. So I think you'll still get a lot of benefit from it. So when we ask ourselves the big picture question, how can we present effectively in English for a primarily American audience? We need to think about responsibility. In academia, in Western culture, in the United States particularly, the onus of responsibility for communication is on the communicator, so on the speaker or on the writer. The listener and the reader have responsibility to understand, but they shouldn't have to work very hard. So the responsibility should mainly fall to the speaker or the writer to communicate clearly to the listener or the reader. it's the idea that if someone doesn't understand me, it's not because they're not intelligent or not because they're not trying, it's because I didn't do a good job communicating to them. And so that's kind of the idea in our heads, what we're thinking about. As we know, about 90% of communication, oral communication, is nonverbal. So eye contact, hand gestures, even just, nodding and giving some sort of acknowledgement, that is a lot of communication as well, and we need to be aware of that when we're making our presentations. I want to talk a little bit about the role of repetition, because this, I think, is a cultural difference. Yvonne and I have talked a little bit about this throughout our tenure of working together. In making a presentation in the US in academia, repetition is not really making an argument. Repeating the same things over and over is not really going to be effective. We would rather use what we call rhetoric, right? Thinking about the audience and how to make our arguments so they are effective for a particular audience in a particular time frame. I don't know, Yvonne, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think this role of repetition in some ways could work in an opposite way, because it could seem that you don't have proper argument, because you don't have new material to add. You start to, like a circle, this could
it
be
could expose your
better.
argument as being weak, perhaps. Yeah. If you don't have much to say about it, then it may not be a strong argument.
Yeah, for sure.
So when we're preparing to present, rhetoricians like to ask these really basic questions, but they're very important. What do I know about my audience? And that could be, how old are they? Where are they from? What culture are they from? What's their level of English? What's their background in English? Any number of things. What's their socioeconomic background? Anything that you can find out about your audience beforehand, I think, would be beneficial information. Are they required to be with you or not? I think that makes a big difference. I've given a lot of teacher trainings, and I noticed a big difference in my audience's receptivity to my message if it's obligatory for them to attend, or if they had to apply or require or request to attend my workshop. So that, I think, is also really important to know. And then we need to think about what kinds of appeals will work for this audience. In academic settings, we often try to appeal to logic, to reason. We often don't think very much about emotions in our responses. We want to kind of sometimes take emotions out of it, although I would argue that's very difficult, if not impossible.
Sometimes.
Yeah. So you want to think about the kinds of appeals that will work for that audience, and then you want to think about, what is your message, right? What are you going to try to convey to them? And your message will be altered if you take all these things into consideration, if you take your audience into consideration, if you take into the appeals, and if you take into your medium, right? Our medium is Zoom. We did some synchronous work, and now we're doing asynchronous work. And that has kind of altered our message a little bit, because we have a different context, and we have to keep that into consideration.
Yeah, I think this is an important point, because when you used to have a face-to-face presentation, you have more signs, you have more information, so you can balance your presentation during the presentation. It's a little bit different when you're in online presentation, because sometimes you don't have all the images, or sometimes it's not possible to follow all the movement that people are doing. So you have to figure out. It's not easy sometimes.
Right. Yeah, and it will change depending on your context too, right? Yeah. So, I mean, today we're going to be talking about the highlights, and when we were even on Zoom a couple of days ago with our participants, we had more discussion, we had more audience participation. So, yeah, it will definitely be a little bit different. So that all kinds of arguments you can consider. Basically, we think about arguments in two major ways: inductive arguments, which is where we kind of start with specifics and move to generalities. That's the kind of triangle. And in writing, we call that kind of an evolving thesis. You don't make your claim right at the very beginning. You kind of work up to the claim, and the conclusion has the main idea or the thesis statement somewhere at the end of the paper. And then we have deductive, which would be start with some generalities and then move to specifics. So that'd be the inverted triangle. And we would often think about this as in writing as like the 5-paragraph essay, where you say your introduction with your thesis statement, and then you try to prove your thesis statement through specific examples and arguments.
This reminds me, when you talk about this, the organization like architecture structure, this reminds me, I don't know if you were aware, the 10 books of architecture, Vitruvius, he suggested at that time 3 topics or 3 main ways that you establish all buildings should be something like sound, functional, and attractive. So there's some kind of beauty, some kind of strongness in terms of structure, and some kind of sound. So these 3 parts of the triad should be used in our building. I think that this kind of suggestion is in some way similar to that structure. So you should have some appeal in terms of strongness, foundation, but it should be something like aesthetic because we are human beings, we're not robots.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And I think that leads really well into, the 3 major kinds of appeals that we like to make. Could be appeals to emotions, which we call pathos, appeals to logic, which we call logos, and appeals like establishing your credibility or the credibility of the speaker. So using other authorities. We see this a lot in advertising when they have like a famous person, spokesperson for a product, but also, Yvonne and I did the same thing this morning. We talked, and he said he's a professor of communications. I talked about my background and my education. That is part of us establishing our ethos as speakers. We want to be seen as experts in our field, as people who are knowledgeable, someone you should listen to. I think that's, very important for speakers to try to establish. When we think about logos, we think of appeals to emotions. The most common example would be use of data and statistics. And use of numbers, right? More, over half the world speaks English, or that's not an accurate data, but these kinds of things are usually appealing to people. People like to say numbers don't lie, which is not exactly accurate because numbers can be interpreted. So,
number depends on human being.
Right. And then we think of appeals to emotion, pathos, trying to kind of tug at your heartstrings, get some sort of emotional response. With the idea that we could use any of these or a combination of them to get the audience to be persuaded to change their mind about something, or to persuade them to take action on something, or to persuade them to consider a different perspective. There's a couple of different, motivations for speaking. So this is, I think, and Michelin, this is like an ad from my childhood. Like I remember this from a while ago. This is an ad for tires, Michelin, because so much is riding on your tires. And what kind of argument do you think is going on here, Yvonne?
Well, emotion.
Yes, trying to approach the emotion with the baby, and the baby. When is a baby ever going to be touching a tire? Like it's just kind of like 2 random objects you put together in a photo, but it is definitely trying to, you want to be a good parent, right?
Look at his or her face, for example.
Yes. Yeah, you want to be a good parent. You want your children to be safe. If you want your children to be safe, you need to buy Michelin tires for your car.
You should take care.
When we realize that, these things are not really 100% connected, right? The brand of tires that you choose is not really 100% connected to the safety of your, mostly it's your driving that's probably more important than the quality of your tires, right? But I think this is a pretty clear example of appealing to emotions. And what kind of argument would you think is going on here?
Yeah, it's supposed to be more logos, more logic because of the numbers and data. But look at her smile. I think she tries to balance this kind of numerical approach with this more emotional approach.
She seems very happy, very inviting. Her eyes are open. She's smiling. And I would argue, especially in terms of advertisements, they probably want to use multiple kinds of appeals simultaneously. And I think that would apply for us when we're speaking or in presenting and writing as well. But definitely there's lots of numbers where you're comparing numbers. Don't you want to make a good informed decision? You need data to make a good informed decision. We're going to give you data, lots of numbers.
And you need number and perspective, because the number by themselves are not necessarily the good tips to make a decision, because without a perspective, you don't know exactly what the number is for. So what are the contests, so we need more than numbers. We need contests, and we need knowledge to interpret the numbers.
Right, and that's why we say, statistics don't speak for themselves. Numbers don't speak for themselves. You have to interpret them. But when we're just looking at an ad, a lot of people, I think, would be moved by this. Yeah. Okay, this one. So This is, again, Colin Kaepernick, who is an American professional football player who is African American, and he decided, I don't know, maybe like a couple of years ago now, maybe 1 or 2 years ago,
Yeah.
to kneel during the national anthem in protest of police brutality against African Americans in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, he was not rehired, or his contract was not, you know, picked up, as they say, and he lost his job and his career, basically. So here we have a picture of his face very close up. Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. Nike, just do it. So
and
what kind of argument do you think is happening here? Huh?
I think the powerness of this image is strictly related to the context, you know, because if you're not aware of the context, where this is come from, where this face, you just pick up the image, you have a face, you have eyes looking, and you have a phrase, believe in something, even it means sacrifice everything. So depends on the context, I think. But if you know, as many people knows, so you have another layer to interpret, you know. In my case, I know what exactly is about it. So it's stronger because fixed eyes, you know, no smile at all. And the shape of the photo is close like a thumb, you know, like a forwardness. So I think it's very strong message, but I think it depends if the audience know the context.
Right, exactly. So this is obviously an appeal to emotion. If you know the context, it's going to be much more emotional to you. I would argue even if you don't know the context, you're still going to be like, wow, that's a very striking image, right? It's very close. It may not have the same emotional impact, but I would say it's definitely, you know, he's looking right into your soul. I mean, you can see.
Directly.
So I definitely feel like this is definitely an emotional appeal, and how deep that goes is going to depend on the audience and the context. Yeah, definitely. So another thing that you'll want to take into consideration as you're preparing your arguments is some cultural differences. If your audience, you know, my audience is Brazilian, Yvonne and I talked a lot about different cultural differences. If you are making a presentation in English to Americans, or even just for an English class where the culture of the class is supposed to be like an English or American culture class, you'll want to consider a couple of these things. In the United States, particularly, you know, hot topics or taboo subjects, you know, religion, politics, abortion, some aspects of race, we don't really talk about that openly. I think people now are making an argument that we should. If you can see what's going on in American culture right now, I think the argument is we should have a conversation about race. Maybe we shouldn't be avoiding it as a hot topic as much as we have in the past.
I think now we live in a time where hot topics are the most people prefer to talk it, because they are the pillars of our society, for good and bad.
But often I know of teachers, it's very common if teachers give an assignment to make an argumentative presentation or write an argumentative essay, I don't want to read anything about, you know, about gun control or the drinking age in the US or abortion or these kinds of things, because so often these kinds of hot topics, you can't really get any movement on them. Like there's no way a student is going to persuade me to change my mind about it, because my beliefs are so strongly held, or my ideas are so strongly about these topics ingrained in me. So a lot of times people say, I don't even want to hear about this, like pick something new, right?
But when these topics mixed with religion, it could be more complicated.
Oh, of course, yes.
This is the problem.
And then just in personal conversation, you know, things that we often don't talk about in the United States, we often don't ask questions about marital status. I mean, we find that, you know, if your mother, when are you going to get married? When, you know, it's okay, I guess, for your mom, but you don't want like a taxi driver to ask you, are you married? Or, you know, someone, your waiter or waitress, you know, your server at a restaurant, that's not, you know, appropriate.
The opposite of Brazil.
Right, yeah. And then salary, we don't, money is a big taboo, like the cost of your house and how much you make and these kinds of things. We often, even among close friends, like I don't know how much money my very, very close friends make. I would only ask them in a situation where I was trying to apply for a job of a similar, you know, rank or similar salary, just to make sure that I was getting offered something appropriate. But normally I wouldn't talk about this, even with my best close friend or my parents even. It's very taboo. Another thing to think about in terms of culture, at least in American culture, we're kind of over slides and PowerPoint. I mean, we don't want to see a ton of slides, a ton of words. I think we need to consider that the slides are a guide, so the audience has something they can focus on that's not just automatically staring at the speaker forever, just to kind of give them some relief. But the most important things should come from the speaker and not from the PowerPoint. Yeah.
Could be dangerous to put all the information on PowerPoint presentation, not on you, because you're supposed to give the presentation, not the slides.
And people would say, why didn't I just read the I could have read these slides in my house, you know?
Exactly.
Why did I come to this presentation when I could have just read the slides at home and gotten all the information? So the next thing we're going to talk about is, there we go, tips for effectively organizing and giving presentations. So we talked about kind of like the theoretical underpinnings about how you want to get your mind ready to, or, you know, to think about your audience, think about your message and how you're going to convey that message, what kinds of arguments you're going to make. And now we're going to talk about how to organize your ideas once you've got them all kind of together. So the goals for this, let me move this over a little bit so we can see our faces. There we go. Is to kind of share some ideas for different ways of organizing presentations, or maybe the most common way we're going to focus on, one of the most common patterns. Again, cultural concerns. I think that is obviously something that is a theme throughout our whole, you know, time together. We're going to talk a little bit about timing. How much time generally do you want to spend on certain kinds of parts of your presentation? We did have practice and reflection in small groups, which, you know, obviously for asynchronous, it's going to be very difficult to do that. But
that was a big part of.
Huh? What?
They love it. They love
it. And that was so what? Yeah, that was the most beautiful part, I think, of our time. And then, yeah, sharing in questions. So, you know, you can obviously, if you're watching us asynchronously, you can think and share with your friend or the person next to you, or maybe you're watching with a friend.
We are living an age for sharing, cooperating.
Yes, we do.
This is the time.
So organizing a presentation in English, again, it's different from repetition. And I think that this is, you know, a point I really want to drive home, especially because Yvonne, you know, we were talking a lot about how this is a very common approach in a lot of different cultures. But it is not.
Sometimes in Brazil, I wouldn't say that it's always, but sometimes repetition by repetition, it's a problem. Especially in an academic environment, because we used to say to our students, you should develop your ideas like music, you know, you have ta-da-da-da, ta-da-da-da-da-da. So you should build the techniques in order to develop your ideas. Of course, it's not easy, but sometimes we see that our student has some difficulty to develop ideas. So repetition comes easily as a way to prevent the emptiness, you know, so you have an empty space, so you should put material, but as you don't know, you're not training enough in order to make more with the less, so try to repetition, but this is not appropriate for academic environment at all.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So one way that we can kind of try to avoid that is, we call this the sandwich method of preparing and organizing. So, you know, a sandwich is a very popular food in the US, you know, bread. And in the middle, we've got, you know, could be meat, could be soy patty, chicken patty, anything, you know, some sort of protein, cheese and lettuce. So the idea behind the bread is, say what you're going to say, give your thesis at the beginning of in your introduction, say your main points or your purpose, and then 3 reasons, 3 examples, 3, you know, maybe different arguments. And then again, in your conclusion, you're going to want to say again your main point or your purpose, but move it forward a little bit. So it's not just a simple repetition.
I think this is a hot topic that we should, here in Brazil especially, we should talk to our children, because they take a long time. You know, when they are in high school, they start to see this kind of material. Of course, we are changing now, but until recently, you're going to see this kind of approach, because this is architecture. So once you know the architecture, you can put it, as you say, you have a sandwich, you could slide this and that. But if you know the structure, it's easier. You don't start from 0 point.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than sitting down and being like, okay, where do I start? You know, if you don't know where to start, this is a good way to kind of help get you into your paper or your presentation or whatever it is. It's like, yeah, it's a good structure, a model, an outline. It doesn't mean everything has to be like this, obviously, or every presentation has to be like this, but as a way to get you you know, inspired or just kind of
Mhm.
sometimes for me, the hardest thing is just getting started. Once I'm started, I kind of get the flow. But
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. It's just a structure, a framework. Mhm. So when we're thinking about introductions, you know, there's a couple of very common ways to begin. You could start with a question. This could be a rhetorical question, or this could be an actual question you want to ask the audience. Maybe it's a poll. I mean, now with technology, you can do so many things. You can give a little survey, you can do a poll, or you can take a couple of answers from, you know, if you have like a microphone, if you're in person, you know, take some answers. That's kind of a good way to kind of get people in, kind of sucked into your presentation or interested in
Mhm.
it. You could share an anecdote. Maybe it's like, I want to tell you a little story about, you know, how I climbed a mountain or whatever. You know, you can talk about a personal anecdote, or you can tell a story about someone else, a colleague, a friend, or an example you came upon in your research for the presentation, a representative example. Or you could begin with a quotation. This is always like a popular, you know, in the United States, start with something that's like, you know, Benjamin Franklin always said, yada,
Yeah.
yada. So that's another, you know, another idea just to kind of get people interested in what's going on. Sorry, give me one second.
Yeah.
I need to turn off
Yeah,
my
I think
phone.
this is a good starting point because usually this is the most difficult part to start it.
Right,
Sometimes you get
right.
freeze, as you
Yes,
know.
yes. And another idea could be, you know, start with a shocking fact or a statistic
Mhm.
or a number. You know, oh, I didn't know that. That's so interesting. Tell me more. You know, like I want to hear more about what you have to say. So
Yeah.
these are just some ideas of ways to begin. Oftentimes in academic writing and academic presentations, we talk about the context, right? We do kind of like a
Mhm.
review of literature. You know, this is what everybody has said about my subject before I came in, and I'm going to tell you
Mhm.
I'm establishing my credibility by sharing with you what everyone else has said. I
Mhm.
understand the conversation, and now I'm going to add my voice to the conversation. And that's kind of the metaphor we use for academic writing, is that idea of a conversation. You're conversing with the people who have written on your subject or spoken on your subject before you, and now you're adding your voice. You're going to tell where you agree with them or disagree with them, and where you are
Mhm.
new and different perspective, you know, that you're
So
presenting.
this is to say that it's not easy.
No, it's
We have
not.
a
Yeah,
several
you're right.
points.
Yeah. So when we think about the actual like insides of the sandwich, you know, the soy patty, the chicken patty, whatever protein you're into, we think of the rule of three. It's just kind of a very comfortable and easy way. Three is like a foundation of, you know, U.S. argumentation. You know, she's tall, beautiful, and intelligent. You know, we have these kinds of
Yeah.
things that three things. It's like holding up, you know, three legs of a chair or a tripod. It's stable, it's comfortable. So it could be three reasons, three arguments, three appeals, you know, three possible solutions if you're doing some sort of problem and
Yeah.
solution, you know, presentation.
It's like a
Uh,
Western foundation, number 3.
yes, it's another foundation, right? Now, of course, if you don't have three arguments or three reasons, that's okay. This is just a guide, right? It's just a framework. It feels comfortable for us to have three. Your audience will be expecting it and probably feel comfortable about it. And they'll know, oh, we're on the third reason. That must mean we're almost done. You know,
Yeah.
our presentation is
But sometimes it's funny because people say, okay, I have 3 points. Number 1, number 2, well, number 3, well, should I say number, you know?
yeah, yeah,
So you should, well, previously.
right. So these are different things. You try not to repeat them, obviously, right? And then we think about, you know, our visuals and our text. We want to try to use, you know, our visuals, you know, effectively, sparingly, so that each visual that you use has more impact, and slides sparingly so that each slide has more impact. We kind of have the less is more take in the US on words and slides, just to show your audience that you are the presentation, not the slides, right? I could hand this group of slides to anybody else, but they wouldn't have the content that I'm going to be giving today. And then my personal, you know, as teaching academic writing and speaking, statistics cannot speak for themselves, or numbers don't speak for themselves. You need to provide context and interpretation. If you let people go off on their own about these numbers, they may not come back to you and pay attention to the presentation. So context, when providing data, I feel like is very important, especially for an academic audience who's used to dealing with data.
Yeah,
in
I think the
general.
problem is that because we are living a visualizing situation, because every time when you try to communicate something in academic environment, but not only in academic environment, you should do some kind of visualizing. You know, you put some data, you put some information, and when you put something visual, it's easy most of the time to engage with people, to show your argument, to show your understanding. The problem is that people sometimes forget that this is just a part of the problem.
Right.
This is not the whole thing. This is just something that you could use in order to make your presentation, to make your argument, to make your discussion, and to present the whole thing. This is the problem. You should balance, but there's no problem in using visual things, all of the material that you have in the digital age. The problem is when you unbalance between your
you
presentation.
definitely don't want to do a death by PowerPoint situation, right? Death by slide. So when we think about our conclusions, again, you will, in a conclusion, the main idea is to say your main argument again. You could propose a solution, but I wouldn't just repeat the argument. I would move it forward or say why it's important, right? What kind of impact do you want to leave your audience with, right? Is this important for the future, for the children, for our development as people, or for future researchers? You know, oftentimes in academic papers, the conclusions are, more research needs to be done. That is, we've concluded that, you know, yeah, right, there's correlation, maybe not causation, but more research needs to be done. And so that would be appropriate for that audience. You want to consider what kind of, you know, impact you want to make for your audience. And that, again, is contextualized. You're going to want to, you know, take into consider all the options and all the things going on with your context and your audience as you are, you know, organizing your presentation.
Yeah, again, we say that one thing is your dissertation, your master thesis, you know, that you wrote. Another thing is your presentation of your master thesis.
Right.
Could be different.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and I think, you know, everybody hopefully is really into their own research and really thinks like it's kind of intuitively important for you because you are interested in it and you think that it's, you know, something that should be studied because you studied it. And I think a main challenge for academics is how do they communicate how important their research is to them? How do they communicate that to a different audience, right? A general audience or even an audience from another academic discipline, right? It's often when you're so passionate and you're so knowledgeable about one particular subject, often it is very difficult to communicate to other audiences how this is important for them as well, when it's just clearly so important to you, right? Yeah, that is a challenge, I feel like, in academia and for a lot of people, not obviously for everyone, but, you know, to kind of convey the importance of their work. And it's necessary because otherwise you don't get funding or you don't get hired or you don't get, you know, to keep doing that research.
Yeah, and there's a famous phrase that Einstein said, if you can communicate it simply, it's because you know.
Right.
If you don't know how to communicate, it's because you don't know properly. I think it's, of course, it's not always this, but I think it's a good saying.
Yeah, something definitely to keep in mind. So after you have kind of done all of your preparation, you've organized your ideas, I think this is a step that a lot of people often don't do, or they skip it, or they don't have time for it because they've maybe waited till the last minute. But, you know, as a language teacher, I definitely want to stress the idea of a process. This is a process, right? I try not to grade my students on their product of their speech. I try to grade them on the process of doing the speech. So I definitely encourage everyone to, you know, practice 40 hours a day, right? Practice 40 hours a day.
Like a musician.
Yes. So record yourself. You know, we have so many tools. You can use your phone, your computer, you know, you can do WhatsApp. You can record yourself on WhatsApp. I mean, there's so many different things you can do. We can use Flipgrid. I often use Flipgrid with my students to do a draft on Flipgrid. So it's like a low stakes assignment. They can record their speeches on Flipgrid and then they can see them and kind of compare and get ideas from someone else. And that's not the full grade, right? They still have another chance to make some changes and revise before they get like the bulk of the weight of the grade. So that I think is a really good idea. I would recommend trying to use your notes, but don't memorize your speech, because if you memorize it and you get stuck, that's going to be really, oh, well, I forgot what I'm supposed to say next.
Yeah.
When your brain should just know, and you might go off on a little tangent and you might not know what you want to say next, but it's definitely going to sound a lot more natural than if you just memorize it and kind of like saying it back like a robot kind of thing. When you record yourself, I definitely would recommend try to use video, try to watch your body language. That could be your head movements, your hands, your facial gestures. Do you look happy? Do you look serious? What are your eyebrows doing? All of these kinds of things. You want to consider because your audience is going to be seeing that. And a lot of times people really don't like looking at themselves. They don't like hearing their own voice, and they avoid doing this part because it is uncomfortable, at least in the beginning. But the more you do it and the more comfortable you become with yourself, I would argue the better you will be as a speaker and a presenter. So
Yeah.
I would say it's worth it, even though it may be uncomfortable.
Yeah, you should train a lot, but I guess about politicians, because when we compare politicians' performance, their bodies say the opposite that they're saying.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. And they're very, famous public speakers. You have to be you would say you have to be a good public speaker to be a successful politician, but I don't know if that's true 100% of the time, but I guess ideally, right? So I would recommend if you're giving a presentation face-to-face, try not to move around too much, try not to pace. I've had students that were just like nervous and just going back and forth and just, whoop, pick a spot, stay there, it's okay. And speaking of I would recommend you listen for those kinds of repetitions, or phrases that you like, as I say, or
As
in my
you know.
opinion, as you know. Yeah, things that you use, not even really to communicate, but just to fill in the time, right? Fill in the gap while your brain is thinking of the next thing to say. Just be aware of that. And then, of course, eye contact and smile. Like I don't think that can ever hurt anybody, right? Trying to connect with your audience, make them feel seen, make them feel connected to you. I think that's probably I would say almost 100% good piece of advice.
Great.
So now that we've kind of done more formal presentations talking about the theoretical underpinnings of making an argument and coming up with what you want to say and presenting it in maybe a more formal setting, we're going to talk a little bit about effective strategies for classroom participation and active discussion in English, because this is something that a lot of students, again, it's cultural, right? In many cultures, students are not expected to participate in class. They're expected to just listen to the teacher, take notes, and
But
they're
there's
not.
a level of participation.
Yes. It's a different level of participation.
Levels.
Right, and often in the United States, at least in universities, there's a specific grade for participation. And so when I have foreign students coming from maybe China or another place where they're not used to participating as much, I try to tell them, try to speak at least twice every class, like you're going to be graded on that. So, try to just make sure your voice is heard, because that's part of your grade. That's what is expected. Professors in American academia, the courses are discussion courses unless they're lab courses. So if it's a discussion
and the
class,
most important thing, I believe, it's because there's a purpose on that. It's not just because of grade, but there's a purpose to participate. It's an opportunity to train, to acquire muscle, but related to your brain and related to how to behave.
And to practice in a safe environment, practice trying on different theories, different ideas, different observations, making different conclusions. And most people, when they're in college, they're at a time when they're learning so many new things. They're just trying to take everything in, and they need a safe space to kind of evolve themselves, right? And part of that is
what kind of tips do you suggest for shy people? What kind of tips?
That's what I told them. Just start with just trying to talk at least twice, like just try to make sure you raise your hand, just force yourself until you feel more comfortable. Try to make sure a class period does not go by without your voice being heard, at least once, try twice, just try to get out there, as much as you can until you feel more comfortable, especially if it's like an English class and maybe has only 20 people, 25 people, that's going to be a lot easier. Now, if it's a lecture, you're not expected really to participate as much in a lecture class with 200 or 300 people. But if it's a small class like English, it's a language class, you are probably going to be expected to participate. So that is something your teacher is going to be watching you for. So just
Mhm.
do your best and just try to fake it till you make it is what we say, right?
All right.
So our goals for this little section, let me just move us down here, is we're going to try to provide some practical templates for what to say in class. You know, obviously there's so many things you could say, but I wanted to give the people that are watching this video and that attended the session a couple of phrases, structures, you know, grammar. They can plug in their ideas so they don't have to worry about how to formulate them, and discuss how to interrupt politely.
Mhm.
That is a cultural thing. It is very difficult to interrupt, and that is something that we have to practice, and it's very different in different cultures and in each culture. We did have a little group and practice and reflection, and then reported our observations and questions and answers.
I think the student got this specific point, and I think it was amazing because, especially at this moment in Brazil, we are living a deep separation between left and right and in the middle. You know, so it's a hard time to make some kind of a discussion. And when you say, okay, let's put some disagreement, for example, you should be brave. You should be courage to start it, because once you start it, it could be very difficult to stop it, and sometimes
Right.
it doesn't end in a good way.
Right.
So I think, yeah, you provide good tips for how to disagree, especially because to agree, it's easy. Of course, you can agree, providing more insightful things, etc. But disagree is the point. It's more
Right.
difficult to disagree.
Or offer a critique, yeah. And I think that brings us to, you know, what do we think is a meaningful contribution, right? Is only agreeing, is that what we would call a meaningful contribution? It's definitely a contribution. It's probably helpful and useful, but is it really meaningful? Are you really contributing to the conversation? And the idea of repetition of ideas is not, I would say, not necessarily, could be, but not necessarily meaningful contribution. If I'm just repeating what you said, or if you're just repeating what I said, could actually be kind of destructive. If I say something and then you repeat what I said, but people respond to it better when you say it, I'm not going to be happy, right? So
Yeah.
that you want to be careful about just repetition of ideas. You want to try to add something new, represent a different perspective. You can politely disagree or show another side. There's so many aspects you can take. So let's talk about agreeing. Let me move us up here a little bit. Go to this side. So, I mean, these are just some templates that I, you know, have seen and heard. Nobody owns these phrases. They are not copywritten. It's just things you are the one that's going to be plugging in the ideas. These are just words to help you frame your ideas. So you could say, yes, I agree with Yvonne that, you know, the sky is blue. And I would add that in
Green.
Kansas, during the fall, the sky is the most beautiful because we get colors of blue and orange and purple and
Yeah.
pink and red, right? So I agree with you on this point, and I want to add to that my own perspective or add another point, right? Or you could say, I agree with Sam because, right? Because of my experience, because of the data, because of this article, you know, something like that. You could say, I think that Jennifer makes a good point and that we should, so give a recommendation. We should try this. We should, you know, explore these ideas. You know, that's a really easy prompt to take up. And then you could say, Tom's point is well taken. We need to blah, blah, blah. So in this case, you're kind of summarizing someone else, agreeing with someone and maybe summarizing the point or adding your own recommendation or suggestion.
And I would add that this is a helpful tool, even to yourself, to agree and disagree with yourself. You know, when you
Yeah.
have an idea, for example, you should make, okay, but if it's true or totally true, or perhaps I should disagree with this or with that because of this. So in part of, so I think this tool is useful for yourself when you're thinking about something important or something that you should put more emphasis. You could use
Yeah,
this.
definitely. Could be. So let's talk about how we can disagree, but we don't want to be insulting. In academia, I mean, obviously academics are humans, so they have passion, but we try to elevate the level of our rhetoric on a respectful tone. And we try not to, you know, just simply insult people. That's more for the public sphere, I guess. Maybe not
Yeah.
not as much for the
Feel
academic
elegant.
sphere. Yeah. So you could say, I see where Sam is coming from, but I have to disagree because, right? You want to acknowledge you understand someone else's perspective. That also helps your own ethos, right? It makes you seem more credible as a speaker because you can say, even though I understand what you're saying, I still have my own point of view.
Yeah.
I can see Jennifer's point, but from my perspective, blah, 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 right? Or while I think what Tom is saying is true for a certain group of people, we should consider another perspective. So it could be true in this scenario or for this group,
Yeah.
but let's consider something else. I think he's making an interesting observation, but I think this. So you can add your own ideas. You can take any of these sentences, add your own ideas, and
And
now
once
you're
you
making a
start
more
it,
meaningful contribution to the conversation.
yeah, but once you started, the next people could use the same strategy.
Yes, yes, that's
This
true.
is the
That's
beauty.
true. So I think one of my favorite things is very rarely do I wholeheartedly agree with someone and wholeheartedly disagree with them. Usually there's something that I agree with them about and something I disagree with them about. And that is, I feel like the most common scenario in any sort of discussion or conversation. So you could say, while I agree with Sam that X, I also think we should consider Y. And these are really kind of grammatically advanced sentences, right? While these are, subordinate clauses and coordinating and subordinating conjunctions, there's a lot going on here. This is not just simple English. This is very sophisticated language, I would argue. What do you think, Yvonne?
Yeah, I think that this reveal your intention, because if you're interested to consider the effort that the other people did, you will consider that. So even if you have disagreement, if you have a different opinion, a different views, you consider the effort because you are interested that people consider you too. So I would say, well, I agree with you with that point, but I would say it differently because, as you said, I have another perspective, and these perspectives come from these because of these numbers, or because of this information,
Right.
and because of this singularity. I think this show respect, because you should show respect in order to be respected. So I think it's an intelligent strategy more than elegant.
Yes.
But it's intelligent because once you pose yourself as an elegant people, someone that respect others, it's easier that others respect you too.
Yeah, definitely. And that's having respect for your audience, right? That's the first thing we know your audience, right? You want them to know that you understand them, find out as much about them as possible, or say, I can see your point of view. I understand what you're saying. I see you. Your perspective is being acknowledged, right? So I can see Ivan's point about X, but I think we should look at it from another perspective. Or Jennifer's observation is interesting, but my experience was just the opposite. This is what happened to me. So that could be a way of showing other data, showing other points of view.
And this is the richness of academic environment, or should be the richness.
Yeah, it should
Constant
be.
development.
Yes, definitely.
Should be.
So again, we want to consider language, tone, volume, gestures. When we're having a discussion in class, some gestures are not the same in every culture. Usually in academic environments, we don't, our hands don't go up like this, like we don't get too physically involved in our discussions. We might want to lean in a little bit, but we're not going to be like pointing fingers or raising our hands or doing things like, that's really, at least in American academia, I've never seen that happen. Maybe people have wanted to do that, but I've not seen it devolve
Here,
like that.
sometimes it happens here in Brazil. Sometimes
it could be, yes.
And sometimes could be many times.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like much more interesting faculty meetings than I've ever been to. So yeah, in academia in the U.S., we try to avoid condescension, excuse me, condescension. I almost said condensation. That's not the same.
Yeah, it's close.
Condescension and sarcasm. That's really not, appropriate for the academic, and that's not showing respect, right? If you treat someone's arguments with a sarcastic tone, it's not. It kind of devalues your own ethos as a speaker, your own credibility, and it also is not showing respect to your audience. We try in academia to avoid raised voices, which can be perceived as threatening, and as can some gestures. I feel like this is why people sometimes feel like academia is boring, that it is devoid of passion. I would argue that it is not. It's just making arguments in a different way. right?
Yeah.
It's a different kind of unwritten set of rules for conversations.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about Yvonne and I, we can talk about our own observations and conclusions and reflections or thoughts for the future. So do you want to go ahead and, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
Ladies first.
Okay, so, my observations of just putting this project together is that, much of communication, it starts in the brain. The idea of thinking before you speak or thinking before you present, I think is really important. And considering not only what is your assignment, what is your topic, but your audience, what do you know about them, what kinds of arguments will be helpful and useful, what will be the most persuasive. There's a lot of underlying questions that I think maybe you're already using, maybe you're already asking yourself, but it's kind of nice to bring it to the forefront of your conscious thought and your conscious preparation. And, when you think about those kinds of things, what's going to work best with your argument, it may alter your message a little bit, but I would argue that it would make your message more impactful and more meaningful. Not every message is appropriate for every audience, so you want to definitely think about that. And every medium. Our medium is, asynchronous online, so we're trying not to make it too long because we know people don't like to watch long videos, and we want to share our information. And we also know that if we record a group of 20 people talking about those things, those people may feel uncomfortable being recorded because, it's not something, they don't know who's going to be watching the video. So I think, that all of these things need to be taken into consideration and considered well and observed as well.
Great. I think we activated the right proportion in this workshop. But related to the topic, I think one important thing that you said and we discussed in our session was it should be open because when we talk about academic presentation, we said that it's more than academic presentation because some of these things that we have discussed, you can use in your life. And I remember that when a student said, we can use it in Portuguese perspective. Remember that? She said, we can use it for Portuguese classrooms. Because of course it's more than academic, because academic is part of our life,
right.
Especially if you are in college or university. But one important thing for me is that it's more than one thing. It's a bunch of things. You have to consider culture. You have to consider yourself, and most of all, I will say that you should consider that you should be able to make this change over the time, because what we're talking about probably will be completely different in 2 years or in 5 years or in 10 years. We don't know, because when we look back 10 years ago, for example, people were saying different things in the real world at that time. But now we are living in a situation that we have a pandemic, COVID-19. People are closing their homes, stressed with many lives all the time. Life is close to depths in this sense, So communication is a little bit different. And some people are saying after this, return to new normal, probably there's no normal.
Probably not. Yeah.
So communication, I think is strongly important.
Yeah.
But with this workshop, I think we touch many important things that they could use in university, they could use in college, and they could use in more space in their jobs, in their lives. So I think with this session, we contribute a lot. Not only in terms of speech and arguments, in terms of how to organize your ideas and how to make a discussion to agree to disagree, but how can you use material to behave, to think, and to communicate with others. I think
right.
Yeah,
because communication is going to be evolving. As you said, coronavirus is forcing us to evolve, right? We're going to be changing, we're going to be evolving, but we still need to be able to think, right? Those kinds of skills, critical thinking skills, communication skills, even though they're going to be evolving, they're not going to disappear, right? There's a difference between evolution and
especially with a smiling face.
Yes. Yeah,
I think it was great.
So what, I don't know at this point, I mean, we obviously can't take questions, but hopefully if people have questions, they can get in touch with us. And for me, I feel like the most important idea was, just think about this as, what you said. How can you apply it in these ideas in other aspects of your life? I think that was a really great takeaway, a really great observation. And what's going to happen next? What do you think? Well, should we think about maybe trying to do this again? I think it would be lovely.
Yeah, we will love it too, because it was a very important experience for students and for me in personally. And I think the US Embassy and Consulate had other programs that we can apply for. But it was amazing to have you with us, and all your gently suggestion in our expertise. It helped us a lot. And the student was very interested to have some kind of continuation, you know.
Yes, and I'm really glad we were able to make this video for the people that couldn't attend. I hope they, you know, those of you watching, I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end, you know, congratulations. You know, we're gonna a virtual certificate from me, I guess. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah, we will deliver for you.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I think that's it for us for today. Yvonne, thank you so much for your partnership. I really enjoyed working with you. And, you know, I'm so glad that we get to share this information with the other people that, you know, wanted to attend that couldn't attend. And we'll see you in the next video. Maybe we'll get our band together and start our own YouTube channel, and
Oh,
we'll be very popular. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I have to thank the U.S. Embassy and Consulate, and thank you, Samantha, for being with us, with your kindness and with your expertise, with your knowledge, and very exciting and very optimistic way, because the student noted your optimism in a very difficult situation. I think this made a hard difference, you know, because we know that people have many problems, and especially in Brazil, infrastructure problems. So sometimes they are interested to be with us in our section, but sometimes the connection is broken, so they try again. But when they get it, they see your smiling face or your suggestion, okay, let's go, you can now, you can. So it works a lot well. So I have to say thank you, and I hope to see you again briefly, if possible.
Yes, sounds great. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.